Hello everybody, welcome to this AWSELVA summer webinar titled A Snapshot of Animal Welfare Worldwide. My name's Ellie Wigham and I'm the Treasurer of AWSELVA, and I'll be chairing this webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to all our 10 speakers that we have this morning. It's going to be a really interesting and exciting morning of talks from all over the globe. Just before we get started, a couple of little housekeeping. So if you'd like to ask a question, that would be great. We'd really encourage some lively discussion. If you just pop them in the chat, therefore we can ask the speakers the questions when they come in, that would be great. If you want to elaborate on any question you've asked, please use the put your hand up function in Zoom so we can keep track of who's asking the question. As you'll see that this webinar is being recorded and it will be put on our YouTube channel and our website afterwards. You will all be muted as you come in, so please keep your Zoom as muted unless you want to ask a question. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. So our first speaker we have is Mark Fisher. So Mark Fisher has been the Principal Advisor for the New Zealand Ministry of Primary Industries Animal Welfare Team. He completed his PhD in animal physiology at the University of Nottingham and has led major research and guided new policy for agriculture and animal welfare throughout a career working across the sectors. So thank you, Mark, and welcome.
Thanks, Ellie. I want to start this snapshot by getting the buttons right. I want to start the snapshot by talking about some drivers of poor animal welfare. Now, I'm retired, so I get to reflect on quite a few decades exposure to farming, science, ethics, and what I really have learned over this time is that we need to start thinking about the context of animal welfare, about the relationships. And so for the remainder of this talk, I'll talk about companion animals, farm animals, road transport, and in the future. But I'd just like to think about the relationships that we have that make animal welfare so complex and at the same time so interesting. And it's this relationship that's summarized in the picture on the right-hand side of the screen. For me, anyway, it summarizes what animal welfare is all about. Obviously, at the bottom and the middle are the animals, and then above that are the people in charge of the animals, in this case, all farmers. But around the outside is the whole lot of people, all the rest of people in society. And that reflects the fact that we all have an impact on animals, directly or indirectly. And I'd argue that because of that, we all have a part to play. So, why do animals suffer? One that most of us are pretty much in agreement are things like insufficient food, unnecessary pain and distress. But why are animals put in this situation? We can have sadistic people, perhaps people that enjoy being cruel to animals. We can have thoughtless people. And we can also have people otherwise in a good position who are suffering from ill health, financial pressures, and personal relationships. And they can impact, or those conditions can impact on the way that animals are treated. There's also the constraints of the system, and we understand that most easily these days in terms of farm animals, in terms of economic history, economic efficiency. But there's also history that makes relationships what they are. And the best insight I've got into this what I've called the constraints of the system is that in 1958 in the UK, it took the income from 36 gallons of milk for a dairy farmer to pay for a single visit for the vet. Now, 50 years later, it was nearly 5 times greater to pay for the vet, the income having to come from 176 gallons of milk. It's quite a complicated thing to get your head around, and there are different ways to interpret it. But it makes you realize that what happens on the farm is not just what happens on the farm. And it's these first 3 bullet points. The first one, insufficient food, etc., we know a lot about. The second one we know more about. But the third one, I think, is not really all that well acknowledged. And if we are, I'm hopeful that if we are to understand the relationship between those first 3 bullet points, we will be able to understand and shape how we intervene in poor animal welfare, and hopefully how we better share responsibilities. So I'll start with companion animals. Now, this gentleman is 69-year-old Neville Thompson, and he was recently mauled to death by his friend's dogs. The friend and his dogs were staying on the property, a rural property. In a second incident, a separate incident, 2 breeders were sentenced after 60 animals, in this case German Shepherds, were found suffering from ill health. Some were tethered without water, food, or enrichment. And they were kept, as you can see in the photograph, in fairly hygienic and unhygienic and basic conditions. Now, the dog is our oldest and closest animal companion. They play a very important part in our lives. How well do we understand that relationship? How well do we understand the dog? And how well do we understand the humans? The next one is showing animals in mud. Winter on farms can be hard, especially as in this case, where there's been unexpected heavy rainfall over quite a period of time. These animals are grazing on crops of swede. And the heavy mud washes into rivers, and it first became apparent within New Zealand a few years ago that this was impacting on the health and management of our rivers and lakes and streams. But also it impacts on animal welfare. As probably most of you are aware, ruminants especially have to rest while they ruminate. And for this, they like to lie down, anything up to about 12 hours for dairy cows, for instance. Now, what's quite interesting about this incident is that the different roles that when you look back in history, what's happened. First of all, plant breeders developed more and more productive fruit crops so that an animal can sit down with its swede and eat and won't have to move, move as much. Whereas 50 years ago, it gobbled its swede fairly quickly and moved on to another break. The second point is, in this case in New Zealand, just how much what we might call activists have played a role in sorting out this poor situation. The people on the right are a small number of really dedicated individuals who stood up to the farming industry, to government, etc., and said this is not good enough. And it was only through their efforts that we got a collaborative solution with farm industries, professionals like veterinarians and the government, etc., coming up with guidelines and regulations to prevent it occurring. Now, I don't know what most people think of activists, but these people put themselves on the line for what they believed. And they weren't what you call normal activists of scale of normality, etc. These were quite level-headed people doing a great job. Related to that one is the view that animals need shelter and shade. Very few of us would disagree with that sentiment expressed in a roadside sign. So instead of looking at the animals, we decided to look at the farmers. And as you know, farmers come in many shapes and sizes, from cowboys through to model farmers and everything in between. And we distilled it down into three groups. The good ones, those that had adequate shelter on their places or were actively developing adequate shelter. Those who knew about the value of shelter, but were unable to provide adequate shelter because of lack of resources or other priorities like paying the mortgage, etc. And those who are a bit more resistant or unwilling. Now, ideally, perhaps we could reward and acknowledge that first group, assist and encourage that second group, and pressure or enforce that third group. But frequently in society, issues such as lack of shade and shelter are portrayed by the outliers, when what we should be doing is looking at being able to provide the resources, the opportunities, and confidence for those groups of farmers who really are in the middle, who want to do the right thing, but are unable to. And at the same time, give a kick up the bum to those who need it. So we need to move, I think, towards understanding what animals are experiencing and building connections with people. You can't just tell people what to do. You have to provide them with information and involve them rather than just tell them what to do. And I'll come back to that in the final slide. The next one is road transport. And I've got two issues here. The first one is hypothermia. Most New Zealand trucks have the engine sitting underneath the cab, so the heat from the engine heats up the livestock crate or pen nearest the cab. The temperature increases in that area of the truck are exacerbated when the truck's stopped and there's no ventilation. And obviously in summer, as our summers are getting warmer. The second issue is the space for animals. We now have trucks with multi-decks. When I was a kid, a sheep truck had 2 decks and a cattle truck had 1. Nowadays, sheep trucks have up to 4 decks and cattle 2. And in association with this, our livestock are getting larger. So how do we design the future? Do we try and make the animals smaller? Make the transport bigger? Only transport when temperatures are cooler? or only lightly load the trucks. All of these come with costs. Who bears them? The animal, the farm or transport industries, or others in society? Should they bear some of the cost? And finally, a taste of the future. We're investigating a code of welfare for bees in New Zealand so that they're treated humanely and their needs are met. I think that's going to open up a whole new can of worms or insects, perhaps even worms. The second one is the inclusion of distinctive Maori worldview. Now, part of this worldview is that all things in the world have a life force or mori that links everything. And I like this because it values connections between everything, the environment, the animals, the people, etc. And what to me it highlights is that we can't be divorced from nature. And the requirement to include this formally in New Zealand because of the relationship between Maori and the Crown, to me is quite a welcome thing, and I would really like to see how this works out in the future. And the third one is the difficult one of climate change. How do we reduce emissions from our farm animals? And this is one interpretation of what the industry has been suggesting. Retire less productive land and plant vines, and at the same time increase farm productivity in other areas. Both these come with costs. And we already know that increasing productivity brings risks of poor animal welfare. What about farmer well-being? We're asking some of these people to work harder at looking after their animals. And I'll end here as I started. Animal welfare is about people as much as animals, and we have to address both. Or, as one novelist said, to create better animals, we have to create better people. And people, as we all know, are quite complex. I came across an art gallery advert this morning. Two youngsters were viewing a blacked out frame. One commented, "Your dad would hate this one." And the other replied, "That's why I like it." And that's like a little indication of just how complex people are and how we're going to start having to box a lot cleverer in the future as we deal with the interrelationship between animals and people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was really interesting. I'm really interested to hear about the guidelines for the welfare of bees. What we'll do now is if you've got any questions for Mark, please pop them in the chat and we'll keep them for the discussion time, which we have scheduled at 10:55. So any questions, Mark, please put them in the chat and we'll give them to them in the discussion. So we'll move on now to our next speaker, who's from Australia, and that's Anne Quaid. So Anne is a lecturer in veterinary science as well as companion animal practitioner in Sydney. Anne is interested in all aspects of small animal health, particularly animal welfare. She loves treating dogs as cats, as well as the more unusual pets. Welcome, Anne, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Ellie. I hope you can hear me okay. G'day from Australia. It's 7-ish p.m. here, so I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of general animal welfare issues that I'm aware of in Australia at the moment, just to give you a taste of what's going on. Just trying to work out this slide advancement. There we go. Whoops, a little bit too gung-ho there. All right, so I really first want to take a moment, slides are carrying on a bit there, to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners on the land on which I'm meeting you from. It's the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and it's upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney Camperdown campus, where I am based, is built. And I want to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. And this is some of the beautiful land around Sydney where we live. I can say though, most of the time I don't see this beautiful part of it. I'm sitting in a building, but it's nice to know that it's there. Just trying to advance my slides, and there seems to be, let me just see, there we go. So one of the big issues, I mean, Mark already talked about transport of animals, and live export of animals remains a significant issue in Australia. But the new Australian government that was elected earlier this year has committed to phasing out live sheep export. There's been ongoing concerns about this industry for a long, long time. The first parliamentary inquiry that I'm aware of happened back in 1985, and I know some viewers may not have even been born back then, but it's been quite a subject of debate for a long time. So animals that are transported on these long boat journeys usually are subject to high stocking rates. There are concerns about heat stress, particularly when we are transporting animals during our winter. They go into the northern summer, which is pretty stressful for them. They suffer from inanition and poor welfare, and as Mark had mentioned as well, ruminants like to be able to lie down, and after quite a while on these ships there is the build-up of a significant fecal pad, which is associated with all kinds of morbidity. So yeah, the interesting thing is the government, whilst they've agreed to phase out live sheep export, have recently announced that that's not going to happen during their first term. So it'll be interesting to see whether this is phased out or not. On live export ships, there's also a requirement at times for an independent veterinarian to be present, and that I believe isn't always the case. So that's something I guess that vets are very conscious of. And now the slides want me to advance with the, let me just see if I can do that. The other area of controversy around animal welfare in Australia, there's been a huge amount of public scrutiny around racing, whether it's of horses or dogs. There have been a couple of really high profile cases. There's been a lot of concern about the whipping of racehorses, and some of you might be familiar with the work of Professor Paul McGreevy, who's done a lot of research into sort of proving, I guess, that whipping actually does cause pain in horses. So that's an area that's gotten a lot of concern. And I suppose the other one in Australia, we briefly in New South Wales, where I live, the state in which I live, there was a ban of greyhound racing for a while, and that was sparked by a large report where they looked into practices around the breeding and the treatment of dogs, and live baiting was considered to be rife within the industry, and that was a source of major concern. There were a number of situations where animal activists, if you like, or animal advocates actually took secret footage of dogs being routinely trained, coursing with live animals as their bait, and understandably that upset many people. So briefly the industry was banned. They campaigned to operate again on the grounds of improving welfare practices, but it still is an issue around Australia, the live baiting of greyhounds. Another concern in racing in general is the wastage of surplus animals or animals that don't perform particularly well. And there was a high profile media investigation a couple of years ago now about the fate of racehorses. So that remains a source of concern among the public as well. a big challenge, Mark's mentioned it already, and I'm sure every speaker will probably allude to it. A big threat to animal welfare is, of course, our climate. Some of you might remember this harrowing news story of the fires in 2019, 2020. It was a very difficult time for Australia. We lost an estimated 3 billion animals. That includes birds, reptiles, amphibians, but also livestock in catastrophic fires. Certainly living in Sydney at the time, the sky was red for months on end. It was apocalyptic, and that was just before the COVID lockdown. So that was in 2019, 2020. Fast forward to 2022, earlier in the year, we had record-breaking floods in northern New South Wales in February and then in March. Many livestock were washed away. Not really much word about wildlife mortality. Veterinary teams tried to assist, but they were also impacted by the disaster. So in one town, for example, I believe it was Lismore, 3 veterinary clinics were completely submerged. One of them was a 2-story clinic, completely underwater. And so that really disrupted the continuity of veterinary care. And this is something when we're thinking about the climate and knowing that there are going to be more of these unpredictable weather events or more severe than had been predicted events, we are going to have situations where people aren't equipped to provide services in an ongoing way. So we need to be thinking about backup plans. Otherwise, it's a real problem for not just animals, but humans. We're also having an extinction crisis in Australia as well. We've seen the loss of around 10% of our terrestrial mammals since European settlement back in 1788. And that's mainly due to habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, and habitat degradation. Introduced species are a problem as well. The main introduced species of concern are cane toads, cats, foxes, and rabbits. So introduced species either compete with or predate on our native animals as well. And this is the Bramble-Cay mellimus, and this is the first species whose extinction has been formally attributed to anthropogenic climate change, and unfortunately is probably not going to be the last. So when we change the environments of these animals, it's very hard for them to reliably obtain food. They're under a lot of stress, they're immunocompromised, and they suffer from disease and starvation. So these are major concerns, and often leading to unseen morbidity and mortality, because a lot of these animals live and die out of sight of most of us. I wanted to throw in infectious diseases. I know this is a welfare talk, but actually all of these diseases have major animal welfare implications. Key infectious disease threats that could decimate the Australian livestock industries, African swine fever, lumpy skin disease, and foot and mouth disease, all of which are coming closer to Australia, and all of which have impacted one of our closest neighbours, which is Indonesia. So the initial approach in the event of an emergency disease outbreak like this would be to try to control the disease, which will likely involve the slaughter of both infected and at-risk animals. And biosecurity and border security have both been ramped up hugely in anticipation of these disease threats, but they remain major concerns for the impact on our animal industries and the health and welfare of livestock as well. African swine fever isn't here yet, but it's certainly close. Lumpy skin disease hasn't been detected in Australia yet, but it was reported in Indonesia, I think in March, and foot and mouth disease was reported in Indonesia in May. So there was an outbreak reported in cattle and spread to Bali, which is one of the more popular holiday destinations for Australian tourists. So that's changed the risk profile for passengers returning to Australia and goods arriving to Australia as well. And we've again strengthened border activities. New measures have been introduced to prevent an incursion. We've also had a biosecurity foot and mouth disease biosecurity response zone determination made this year to strengthen the measures in place at our border. So again, this is definitely a concern for anyone worried about the welfare of animals. I want to touch briefly on companion animals and infectious disease. I know monkeypox is a big issue around the world. And so some of you might have seen this report in, I think it was the Lancet recently, was a case of, I think it was an Italian greyhound that contracted the monkeypox from the owners after living in close quarters with infected owners. And that has raised a lot of concerns. Some of my clients, my human clients, have been asking what to do about this, and it's not an easy question to answer. So with regard to infectious diseases, concerns about transmission of diseases from humans to animals and then back again were really heightened during the COVID pandemic. And they raised a lot of questions about how owners and veterinarians should interact with each other and should interact with companion animals when they come to veterinary settings as well. And there's not really a consensus view around that. And we don't really understand for different diseases the fomite risk that animals can represent as well. So there is a lot of uncertainty there. And of course, when people are uncertain and they're frightened, there is a risk that they might compromise the welfare of the animals. So during the early months of the COVID pandemic, and for varying periods after that, veterinary services in Australia certainly responded by contacting low and no contact. They were conducting low and no contact consultations, and that included euthanasia consultations. So this is a study on the right-hand side of the screen that was part of my PhD project, looking at low and no contact euthanasia, because when I surveyed veterinary team members about the ethical challenges they faced during the COVID pandemic, low and no contact euthanasia was mentioned by about 20% of respondents. It was very distressing, and other researchers have found that it was also very distressing for owners and probably their animals as well. So to me, what this all says is there's a real pressing need for animal welfare scientists and animal welfare focused practitioners to get together with infectious disease focused practitioners and really work through these protocols in a way that acknowledges the welfare of animals, the humans that live with them, and the human animal bond. Just going back for a second to our introduced species in Australia, we've got high rates of euthanasia of cats in shelters. There's a big cat population in Australia, mostly unowned or semi-owned. So we have sort of feral cats that don't depend on humans at all. We have a lot of semi-owned cats that are voluntarily fed by people who don't take full custody of those cats, and therefore they're out in the environment, potentially predating wildlife, acting as a nuisance, and so on. Their pest status in Australia has earned them unpopularity, if one earns unpopularity. And so they're really perceived as lower value than dogs. They're quite ubiquitous as well anyway. And I guess the other problem is that if you think of something as a pest, or if the public thinks of a species as a pest, then they can justify to themselves sometimes quite inhumane destruction of those animals on the grounds that they're trying to do something positive for wildlife. So that is a real concern. There's a lot of effort in Australia to promote early age desexing of cats to humanely control cat populations. Trap neuter return is very controversial in Australia and legally not easily done, because you're releasing a predator. So that sort of hinders the use of TNR in our context in many jurisdictions. But a lot of shelters are desperately working hard to increase reclaim and rehome rates of cats that end up in their care. And I think that, you know, the treatment of cats is, and the management of cats is a very important welfare issue, not just for cats, but other species. In animal welfare developments, DAF released the Australian Animal Welfare Standards and Guidelines for Poultry recently. The key points are the phasing out of conventional layer hen cages by 2036, so quite a while away. But from this year, all new cages must contain nesting areas, and layer hens must also have access to perches or platforms and a scratch area. Animal welfare groups, of course, say that's not enough, and the I guess industry groups are saying, oh, this is too much of an imposition. Why should we bear the costs? As Mark was saying, who does bear the costs of these improvements in animal welfare? And there's real debate about that. The Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act in New South Wales has been amended, so it finally recognises animal sentience. It also establishes that people have a duty of care towards animals to provide, to ensure their physical and mental welfare. It also includes, extends the definition of pain to include mental and emotional suffering or distress, as well as physical pain. And it requires current animal welfare assessment models and best practice to be taken into account by courts in determining whether a person is guilty of an animal cruelty offence or not. So this is a big leap for us. And finally, I just wanted to mention, just in terms of laboratory animals, because we use a lot of laboratory animals, ANZCART, which is the Australian and New Zealand Council for the Care of Animals in Research and Teaching, an independent organisation, has drafted an openness agreement, which is based on the UK's Concordat. And a recent survey that ANZCART commissioned did find very high public support for openness among Australians, for openness around research. New Zealand's already ahead of us. You guys have already launched an openness agreement in February, which is wonderful, but hopefully the Australian openness agreement is coming very soon. So on that note, I think I'll finish up. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Anne. That was really interesting. Again, if you've got any questions for Anne, please pop them in the chat and we will get back to them when we get to our discussion at 10:55. So from Australia, we are now moving to Sweden with Lotta Berg. So Lotta is a professor in animal environment and health at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, working mainly on animal welfare and law, preventive veterinary medicine, farm animals, one health and one welfare. Welcome, Lotta, and thank you very much. I think you might still be muted there, Lotta.
Yes, now I think that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yes, very good. Thank you. So let's see now if I can change slides. Let's see. Yes, that's to give you a snapshot from Sweden. Well, a little different things that have been going on during the previous year and what's coming up. Let's see if I can get this one to change. Yes. Some examples of current issues that I'll bring up today is that we had a new Animal Welfare Act a couple of years ago. We look into the side of sanctions, penalties, where there are some changes coming up. We're looking at stricter rules for cats. I've been listening into the previous talks, and we do share a lot of problems between our countries. So, for example, with feral cats or unowned cats. And then also mentioning crisis preparedness, that is sort of on everybody's agenda nowadays. And also conclude with some general aspects of the animal welfare debate as a whole. So we had a new Animal Welfare Act in 2018. So you might want to argue that it's not that new, really. But of course, it's not just the act itself. That's a framework. What we also have to do then, or the government has to do, to be precise, is that everything else has to be adjusted to it. If there's a new act, the National Animal Welfare Regulation, that's decided by the government, not the Parliament, and the specific requirements decided by the competent authority, in this case, the Swedish Board of Agriculture, they need to adjust that to the changes in the Animal Welfare Act. And this adjustment takes time, so it's still ongoing when it comes to all the details for various species. So, well then, what are the differences? And one important aspect is that the aim of the legislation at a very general level has been expanded from just focusing on preventing unnecessary suffering to promoting welfare, animal welfare, and respect for the animals. But that's all nice. We need to see how it's actually going to be translated into changes in legislation or recommendations to see what difference it makes in practice. But that's what's happening. So trying to widen the scope, not just from preventing bad things from happening, but also trying to encourage people to do things that are actually on the good side. We'll see. Which a lot of people just do anyway, of course, but this is the legislation, the floor. Other than that, I would say that the new Animal Welfare Act contains a number of updates related to new knowledge and research, some clarifications where people have been interpreting the same paragraph in different ways, which is just confusing, but really no dramatic changes from an animal welfare point of view. However, there's been a debate over very mild sentences for cruelty to animals. And this was all looked into by experts, and what we now have is from new legislation that's actually in place from July 1st this year. So I can't really say anything about the outcome yet. We just know that there is new legislation, but of course nobody's been through the legal process yet, where they did introduce another section of the legislation to cover severe neglect and severe cruelty. I mean, we all know that the main point of having animal welfare regulations is to prevent unnecessary suffering, to ensure that the animals are provided with a reasonably good life from the beginning. So the focus is not on punishment, it's on prevention. And often if an animal welfare inspector has been at a report asking for improvements or an injunction in most of the cases is enough to achieve improvement in animal husbandry. But for what people see as true crimes to animals, society asks for punishment like for any other crime. And previously we had just a set of penalties that covered fines, conditional fines, and prisons up until 2 years. But rarely ever anybody ended up in prison. It was usually a lot of these people are sort of first-time offenders, or they are criminals with a lot of other things on the records, which means that it's difficult to know in the end if they end up for 2 years in prison. Was it because of bank robbery? Was it because of fraud? Was it because of dealing with drugs? Or was it because of cruelty to animals? Because these crimes tend to consume each other from a legal point of view. So what they now did was they decided on a new set of rules for really severe cases where suffering is severe, or where it's a large scale, so involving a large number of animals, or where it's related to basically financial reasons, greed, I think is the word in the legislation, or specific brutality. So if it's done to earn more money, it's more severe than if it's done just because you didn't know better. That's the thought. Where people can actually end up in prison for 6 months to 4 years. Will it make a difference? From a preventive point of view, I have no idea. It's going to be interesting to follow this up, but it's from July 1st, so we don't know yet. We're also looking at introducing financial sanctions as an alternative to fines. A fine is a punishment that is set by an administrative court. So it's not necessarily a crime, but it's an administrative court, not a criminal court. So currently we've had fines, conditional fines, which means that, well, okay, if you've done this bad, if you do it again, this is a higher fine each time it happens. So that's now something else with the introducing a fee, not a court decision. It's purely administrative, like a parking ticket, if you like. Okay, and of course it has to be applied mainly for simple yes/no issues where there's not much of an evaluation from the court side, because then you need a court. This is more like, yeah, you didn't have the necessary certificates, here's your fine or your fee. Or you didn't, the person working at the slaughterhouse didn't have the necessary certificate of competence. Okay, here's your administrative fee. To take some of the work off the courts that are quite busy, and also to simplify it. Mainly aiming at companies, food business operators, but also, I mean, it's quite possible to apply this also to private individuals. The thought is it should be more rapid and efficient. We'll see. Right, for the cats, from 1st of January next year, there will be a request for ID tagging of all cats. This is already applied by many cat owners, but not all. And actually the request for reproductive control of cats is already in place. So the aim is to minimize the number of stray and abandoned cats. But it's mainly normative in a way, because there's nobody going to go around and check the ID of all cats, and they're still allowed to run free. But it will tell people that this is something important. You should do this with an ID chip or tattoo. And then, of course, there's a national cat register then. And there are, as I said, also requirements for reproductive control to minimize the number of unwanted kittens. So people are expected to spay or neuter the cats, or keep them indoors, or use fenced outdoor runs, or use contraceptives for the cats. This is in place. It hasn't really happened yet, so that it's going to take like a generation, I think, to change people's mind about what you do to cats. And also the authorities haven't been that strict yet. So we'll see if this is actually implemented the way it says in the legislation, that it would make a huge difference. So we'll have to wait and see. Generally, crisis preparedness, yes, coming up in Sweden as well. We have had the pandemic, we're seeing war, not in Sweden, mind you, but in our neighborhood in Ukraine. And this brings up the debate whether we can produce our own food. Can we take care of our farm animals and pets in a situation of crisis, providing veterinary care, providing feed for them, providing everyday care if people have to evacuate, etc., etc. Also looking at the biosecurity when we have disease outbreaks, of course, but also animal welfare in case of disease outbreaks related to depopulation, evacuation, etc. What can you do and what you can't do? One aspect of this from a society point of view is the increased interest in adopting stray or unwanted dogs from other countries. We don't have stray or dogs in Sweden really, but there are plenty in other European countries and other neighbors such as Russia. So we have seen an influx of diseases or questions about diseases, anything that from rabies and heartworm to brucellosis or tapeworm or leishmaniasis, etc. Because there are of course rules about this, what you'd have to do before bringing a dog into the country, but people basically do not necessarily obey these rules. There's a lot of smuggling going on, fake certificates mainly from Eastern Europe, I'm afraid. And this raises, of course, animal welfare questions, but also work safety issues for vets, where veterinarians wonder about having to take rabies shots, etc. And also having to, if they suspect that a dog has been smuggled, having to decide whether to talk to the authorities or not about this. So it's a lot of mental pressure on vets in this case. And this is also, of course, related to the large number of pets coming with refugees from Ukraine. A lot of them very well kept, well managed, and with all the right vaccinations, some not. And also other groups of people seeing the possibility of introducing a lot of pets to Sweden that are not really Ukrainian, but that's a way of finding a loophole. And this is putting a lot of strain on the veterinary business, adding to that another 20% higher number of dogs because of the pandemic, and people were bored, so they got a dog, which means that we now have a shortage of veterinarians. And finally, the general animal welfare debate in society. That has been mainly recently focused on food security rather than animal welfare. So there's a sort of a backlash, I'd say, in animal welfare, although people in general will still be very, very interested in animal welfare. But you nowadays, what you didn't 10 years ago, see the argument that, well, we can't do much about welfare because we need food. Whereas others will, of course, argue that there is no contradiction. On the contrary, they go hand in hand. But there's always the issue of comparing farming conditions with competitors within or outside the EU on animal welfare legislation, but of course also now on situations on feed availability, manure costs, the costs for handling, getting rid of manure, disposal costs. But also now with the climate changes, etc. So a lot of debate about our food production system in general. And the consequences, we don't know yet whether there will be, so far there hasn't been a requirement for sort of relaxing the animal welfare legislation because there's really no way back. But maybe there will be. There is, for example, a debate on the necessity of bringing cows out on pasture in the summer, which is currently a legal requirement for dairy cows and beef cows as well. They have to go outside on pasture for a couple of months every summer. And some people want to remove that requirement. All again in the name of, well, they will produce more if you don't let them out because we can give them more concentrated feed indoors, etc. Fish farming is growing. The animal welfare of fish is really being discussed a lot with a lot of thoughts and ideas and very little knowledge, I'm afraid. Righty, I think that was it from my side before I ran over too much. So thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you so much, Lotte. That was really interesting. It's really interesting to hear about the developments in the Swedish legislation. Unfortunately, Lotte can't join us for any discussion for the session. She's got to run off another meeting. So thank you very much for your time, Lotte. That was really great. So we're moving from Sweden now over to Hong Kong with Kim McCoy. So Kim is a practicing barrister in both Hong Kong and New Zealand and is the founder of the Hong Kong Animal Law and Protection Organisation. He has a keen interest in the intersection between criminal, civil and public law with animal law, as well as wildlife crime, both locally and internationally. Welcome, Kim, and thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone. Now, I am going to try and use this as well successfully. My cat has just come into the room, so if you hear some noise in the background, I do apologize. So I'm going to talk about Hong Kong's relationship with animals, focusing on two major areas which made international news this year, which is wild boars and hamsters. But when we think about Hong Kong and animals, it's not usually good news. Our animal legislation has remained largely unchanged for about 80 years, although we are getting a bill put forward this year to amend the protection of animal, the legislation that protects animals here in Hong Kong. But we're still using very archaic and Victorian language such as ill-treating, overriding, overloading, which we don't really use all that much these days. But cruelty is prevalent here. It remains a summary offence, so there's only a 6-month time limit for prosecutions to happen. And often that's not long enough for investigations to be made because you're not catching people red-handed committing these acts of cruelty. There's a very poor conversion rate from arrest to conviction. And there's been a recent empirical study authored by Professor Whitford and Dr. Woodhouse in Hong Kong, which speaks to all of this. And it's a very valuable read for anyone who's interested in this area. Ultimately, those people who are eventually brought to the judicial system and the court system and are prosecuted are getting sentences imposed, which are essentially a slap on the wrist. The courts aren't using their full sentencing powers, and they're not reflective of the cruelty that's actually inflicted on these animals. Very similar to what Lotte was saying happens in Sweden. And so Hong Kong has this unfortunate label of being a passive animal welfare place, but it's also a terrible place for wildlife trafficking because we're geographically very central. We have a lack of enforcement and again, a very poor conversion from arrest to prosecution to conviction. And the sentencing just makes no deterrence for people, because they are, again, getting a slap on the wrist and then walking free. So it's a shame. And these are things that I could talk about for a long time, but I won't. We're here to talk about wild boars and hamsters. So in late 2021, the Hong Kong government introduced this new strategy to manage the population of wild boars, which was to capture them and send them off for humane dispatch. And similar to what Anne said, as soon as animals become a pest, the inhumane actions are almost justified. And that's what we saw in Hong Kong. There was a previous policy of capture, contraception, and then relocating them to remote areas. But as soon as we saw wild boars starting to encroach into more urbanized areas, attacking people, biting people, like hikers and police officers, the government sort of thought something needs to change. And what we're going to do is we're going to cull the wild boars. And so what they decided to do was to introduce this humane dispatch. And so people would go out, they would lure out wild boars from their habitat in the wild with bread. They would come into more populated areas and they would shoot them and euthanize them. So there was absolutely nothing humane about this operation. Now, where I live in Hong Kong, it's a rather built-up urban area, but I see wild pigs every night. They come into these areas for one thing, because they're hungry. But the method of luring out these wild boars and to kill them was just, frankly, barbaric and just despicable. Now, there are so many alternatives that could have been employed. The main thing that I think would have made the biggest difference, and I think will be put into practice, is the changing of the rubbish bins. So we have these really heinous, bright orange rubbish bins that sit on our road. They're flimsy. I could blow it over with my own breath. So wild pigs come over, they're attracted by the smell of food rubbish, and they knock them over with their snouts and they dig in. I mean, create rubbish bins that are more sturdy, protective from animals, and there's going to be a less of a likelihood that the pigs are going to come into these urban areas looking for food. Educate the public about the dangers of feeding these wild animals and increase the penalties for those who do so. I mean, as soon as you start feeding wild animals, you're creating this unrealistic situation in the population. The females are giving birth to a larger number of young because there's an overabundance of food, but and it's unnatural food source. So this creates a wholly circular problem, because they then have to try and find the food outside of their natural habitat, which means coming into more urbanized areas and therefore and thereafter perhaps coming into humans and attacking them. So since recommencing this operation in November, there's been 163 wild boars that have been killed. Now, in Hong Kong, we're extremely grateful that we have organizations such as the SPCA, the Wild Boar Concern Group, that continue to tirelessly protect these animals. But the main message that the government should have been adhering to is that you use non-lethal measures and you exhaust all of those non-lethal measures before you even consider the way they did. Very similarly, hamsters. Now, in early 2022, a pet store owner in Hong Kong became infected with the Delta variant of COVID. And after testing some of the hamsters in the store, the government realized the hamsters had tested positive. And so there was a mandate to cull hamsters in Hong Kong, and they decided to cull more than 2,000 hamsters, which had been imported into the city. Now, any members of the public who had purchased a hamster after a certain date, I think it was late December before Christmas, were advised to hand over their animal for testing in euthanasia. Now, this caused mass panic in Hong Kong, because in Hong Kong, we're still going for a zero COVID policy, which is frankly unattainable, but that's the standard which we're trying to meet. So as soon as there's any insight as to, or thought that there is COVID rife in the community, then drastic measures will be employed. So the fearmongering and unwarranted pressure began to build, and people were starting to panic. So they were abandoning their animals, they were handing over their pets. But the pets the hamsters are your personal property. There's no directive that could ever allow or require you to hand over something that belongs to you. And that's why the government was quite clever in what they do. And they introduced this waiver that any pet owner had to sign. As soon as you handed over your hamster, you signed a waiver which said, I consent to my property, my animal, to be released to the government. Oh, and by the way, you're no longer allowed to ask about this pet ever again, because we all know what would happen to it. So that was a big concern. And again, very similarly, non-lethal measures are always to be employed rather than, you know, just a mass culling of animals. Set up quarantine facilities, increase testing, especially if you're pursuing a zero COVID policy, and employ evidence-based risk analysis. I mean, in Hong Kong, we have the Prevention of Control of Disease laws, which essentially gives the government a wide sweeping power. They can do whatever they like in the name of controlling disease. Now, these powers are often utilized without really first thinking about a balanced or evidence-based approach. And so decisions are made and fear starts to grow in the society. So that's a big thing in Hong Kong. Now, the lives of the animals also need to be taken into consideration, but all too often they seem to be bystanders in what is a decision which is made wholly without any merit. So, you know, I hope these two incidents will hopefully allow the government to start thinking more about the animals rather than just a sort of press the red button and execute mandate. What does the future look like? It's a very good question, and I wish I had the proper answer, but this is what I think the future looks like. Now, we've got a long way to go in terms of animal law and animal welfare. The problem is a lack of urgency from the government to do anything that changes or improves animal welfare. As I said at the start of the talk, there is a bill that should be or go through the government this year, which looks to amend our ordinance or our legislation that protects animals. And this will introduce a duty of care, which we don't have at the moment. It will increase penalties for animal cruelty, and there's going to be greater powers of investigation and other matters which do sort of promote animal welfare. Now, it's very evident here from where I'm sitting that if the government want to do something, they can do it very quickly. And we've seen that in the past 3 years through this pandemic. And they're prepared to do so without much hesitation. But when it comes to animals, for some reason, we seem to hit a wall. There's not much emphasis, despite, you know, the authors of incredible papers and people giving talks on why it's so necessary. There's just not much emphasis on why, and animal-related issues tend to take a back seat here in Hong Kong. Now, I'm not expecting things to happen overnight, and I don't think, you know, clicking my fingers and hoping that Hong Kong becomes this worldwide leader in animal welfare is going to ever happen. But at least things are happening here, slowly but steadily. But we are privileged to have incredible, you know, veterinary scientists, lawyers and educators here that keep promoting animal welfare issues and keep the pressure on the government. But the biggest thing I hope that we can do here in Hong Kong is just to change the mindset of those in our society. We can't keep looking at animals as expendable articles. They're not just things that we can toss out or things that we can just shoot and forget about. They are sentient, intelligent beings that deserve our protection. And I mean, the reason why we have animal welfare law and animal protection law is because they aren't able to speak. So we do the speaking for them. And so long as society changes their mindset and understands, yes, that's my role in this society. I protect humans and I also protect non-human animals as well. And if we can all do that, hopefully Hong Kong can start coming into sort of a bit of a powerhouse in terms of animal welfare. But again, change doesn't happen overnight, but so long as someone keeps putting the pressure on, then yeah, hopefully things will change. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you very much, Kim. Really interesting. There's a quick question for you in the chat, actually, Kim, and it says, do you know how the hamsters were euthanized? Were they gas en masse, handled for injections, etc.? And they couldn't find any evidence of how it was actually done, rather than that it was humane.
Yeah, I like how the question also put humane in parentheses as well. So I don't know myself. I would assume injecting each one of those hamsters individually would take a very long time. So I assume it would be some sort of gas mechanism. But I'm not certain, sorry.
That's okay. Thank you very much. There's also a question we had a bit earlier, which was more of a comment, actually, regarding the animal activists. It says, and there's an article in The Guardian yesterday describing scientists as necessary activists in the era of climate change, and the role of how scientists might or ought to contribute now. Animal welfare science was constructed a mandate science. Maybe there's a need for more scientific activism in animal welfare. Do any of our speakers have any comments on Andrew's comment?
I think it's an excellent point. I mean, sorry, I'll just make my screen visible. I think that if you really believe in evidence-based science, then it makes sense that in the light of new evidence, we need to change our practices, and therefore scientists have a role in informing people about the new evidence and encouraging people to adopt new practices based on evidence. That makes perfect sense to me. But the word activist is used pejoratively in a lot of contexts. We often use it to discredit people, and I think that's really problematic, because really most of us who want to make a change for good could describe ourselves as activists in some way. So I don't really like the use of the word, but I do fall back on it sometimes because it's used so commonly.
Yeah, exactly. Anyone else got any comments to add? If anyone's got any more questions, please just pop them in the chat, and we'll give them to our speakers. If we haven't got any questions, there's a question here from Vanessa, which just says, thanks for the great talk. Mark has made clear the link between animal welfare and context, specifically human relationships. What does this mean for methods in animal welfare research? It's a good question. Thanks, Vanessa. Do you have anything to?
What does it mean for methods in animal welfare? Is that the
Methods in animal welfare research?
No, I don't know the answer to that one, but I will make a comment on the previous one. I think science is one way of understanding the world. Yes, a pretty powerful way, but I don't think it's the only way. So perhaps we have to listen to the people that do the husbandry as well. They know animals pretty good, and there's lots of other ways of knowing in the world. And maybe that we come back to the methods in animal welfare science, maybe we have to broaden our scope a little bit and be prepared to think beyond what we're traditionally trained in. I don't know if that answers the question.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the second session of today's webinar. We'll get started on time, so we've got 4 excellent talks lined up. Same as previous, if you've got any questions or comments, please pop them into the chat and we'll get to them in our second discussion session, which will be at 11:55. Okay, so without further ado, let's introduce our first speaker of this session, which is from Kenya. So it's Judy Murithi, who is a recipient of our International Advocates Law LLM Scholarship and comes from Kenya. After completing her degree, she returned to her position in legal affairs for Wildlife Direct. Judy works in the investigative legal department, responsible for prosecuting seizure cases and other criminal activities related to wildlife. So welcome, Judy, and thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome. My presentation will be very brief to talk on this presentation, I'll talk about the animal welfare reforms that we've had in Africa. And so I'll head right straight to what happened in the beginning of the year, where we had the UNEA resolution on animal welfare at UNEA in Kenya, Nairobi. And so with that came in with it was a prehistoric event, and it will be really, really good because it was driven by Africa and in Africa. So that shows already that Africa itself, with the policymakers and the lawmakers, are already embracing animal welfare and are ready to come up with policies that advance animal welfare in Africa in general. And in light of that, African Union has been working hand in hand to incorporate the One Welfare, One Health principle in its eradicating the health challenges that we have in Africa. We have Ebola, we have swine flu, we have all these diseases that are in Africa. And so the African Union has been really working with the CDC, UNICEF, WHO, UNFDC to come up with specific policies, or rather specific actions that are supposed to be accepted, or rather developed by the countries, so that can be able to have good practices that reduce the zoonotic diseases. Also in Kenya, we saw that in the marketing arena, where Carrefour is in Kenya, the franchise as established in Kenya by Alpha Time, they are to drop the cage-free hens from the shelves. This shows a very huge fundamental shift in the Africa market arena, because with this, that means most farmers now, as they were embracing the cage-free, that means now they'll start using cruel-free ways of rearing their hens, which is definitely a very good shift for the animals. And also here you can see the marketing and animal welfare, the key to success. And so as the messaging has been going on, that we need animal cruel-free products, then the consumers have always been increasing their need to see those products, rather that specific emblem on the products for them to consume. Like if they're to get the poultry products, they need to see that is cage-free. You see that, so the messaging is very, very important. You can see that all the markets that have been able to incorporate that message by incorporating the good standards, that their markets their sales have increased. This shows that already, even in the market itself, by just the mere indication of that, the authentication of the standard, it increases as well. So in that, they're embracing the good animal welfare. And so this South Africa has been the forefront in animal reforms the couple of years, and we've seen various steps by the government to come up with laws that are embracing the animal cruelty-free practices. Recently, now they've been really trying to come up with bylaws that are surrounding the slaughter in animals in South Africa. They are proposing decisions in terms of the length of times for which the animals they should stay between the slaughtering and the transport system. And so you see, if the transport system is already improved and how well the slaughtering occurs, we know that how we treat animals in terms of slaughter is really depends. It reflects on the product you're going to get. And so with these kind of laws that are embracing proper animal welfare, then it means there will be better animals in Africa. And in Kenya, we can see that transporting chicken on top of vehicles is illegal. You see, in Kenya, for the longest time, we've had the Animal Cruelty Act, which is aimed to protect animals from unkind treatments. And so with this, the main problem with that law was the enforcement. And so we can see that the National Police Service has now been able to bring in, or rather come up with a mandate, or rather come up with specific policies that are going to ensure that they're going to enforce the law. And so with this, then if anytime a person is transporting the chicken in a specific manner, then they will be arrested. And also to sum up all these things is that Africa right now has so much issues of food security. And so stunted growth, malnutrition, and everything. And so, with the increase, rather the encouragement by the policymakers for the people to take meat to cater for the food security aspect of Africa, there is need for messaging in terms of cruel-free products. And so there's a need for the movement to continually encourage farmers to adopt specific practices that are humane-free, that are humane and are profitable for the animals. And with that, then we'll see by the shift with the projection that we have right now, is that even as we continually encourage people to eat more animal products for the benefit of the malnutrition, the food security aspect of Africa, then there will be no practices that are cruel-free. Because even with the factory farms, then that means the issue of factory farms will not be an issue in Kenya, because now, or rather in Africa, because we will incorporate sustainable, integrated methods of getting the animal products. Okay, that's it for now. Okay. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Judy. That was really interesting. If anyone's got any other questions for Judy, please pop them in the chat and we'll ask them during our discussion section. Okay, so from Kenya, we're now heading over to Spain, and we have Xavi Manteca. So Xavi received his veterinary degree from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. He has an MSc in Applied Animal Behaviour and Animal Welfare from the University of Edinburgh. He also has a PhD from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Currently, he is a professor at the School of Veterinary Science in Barcelona, where he teaches animal behaviour and animal welfare. So welcome, Xavi, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ellie, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Thank you for the invite. What I'd like to do over the next 10 minutes, for the sake of time, is to focus on three recent developments related to animal welfare in Spain, which to me are the most significant. These are the development of a new Spanish law on animal welfare, changes in the curriculum of veterinary schools to provide more training on animal welfare, and finally, public debate on farming, particularly the perceived conflict between intensive industrial farming and more extensive traditional forms of animal farming. Okay, so Spanish law on animal welfare. Now, a few weeks ago, I think it was on the 2nd of August this year, the Spanish government approved a new law on animal welfare that will be sent to the Parliament for final approval. Now, to give you a little bit of context, what happens in Spain as it comes to animal welfare law is that for farm animals and laboratory animals, we basically apply European Union legislation, and that's it. When it comes to companion animals, the problem is that there is no specific European Union legislation. And then we do have our own laws. But based on the Spanish political organization, until now, companion animal protection was to a large extent the responsibility of each regional government in Spain, which created significant disparities across the country. On top of this, we still have a significant problem of abandonment of dogs and cats in Spain. And finally, as it happens in many other countries, we have an increasing number of so-called exotic pets, which have caused welfare issues and environmental issues as well. And it is in this context that the Spanish government has approved this new law, which basically, and because the scenario I just described, basically is focused on companion animals, which, as I said, are not covered by European legislation to a significant extent. So the law basically doesn't touch upon farm or laboratory animals, and it has to be approved by the Spanish Parliament. Now, it is impossible to know for sure how this is going to develop, but everything seems to indicate that the Parliament will approve the law as it is, or at most with some minor changes. The whole process of approval in the Parliament may take a few months, so if everything goes as we expect, the law will come into force beginning next year in 2023. Now, these are the main aspects, or perhaps the most polemic aspects of the law. Now, once the law comes into force, everybody, every person willing to own a dog in Spain will have to pass a test. This, in principle, may seem a little bit extreme to some people. What the government is arguing is that by this, they want to decrease the compulsive buying of dogs, the impulsive buying of dogs and cats that happens particularly at some times of the year, and that then result a few months later in abandonment. So they think that by making it compulsory to pass this test, many people will think twice before getting a dog. Now, a second interesting aspect of the law is that dogs can be left unsupervised for a maximum of 24 hours, no longer than that. And perhaps the most interesting aspect as it comes to traditional companion animals is that dog breeding will be allowed only in recognized centers. So basically, this means that a private person will not be allowed to breed dogs unless he or she goes through the process of becoming recognized as an center, a breeding center. The consequence of this is that if a private person has several dogs of different sex, and this person has not been recognized as a breeder, all dogs of at least one sex will have to be neutered to guarantee that there is no breeding in a non-recognized center. Another aspect is that selling dogs, cats, and other companion animals in shops will not be allowed. So they will be acquired only in recognized centers, excluding shops. As it comes to non-traditional companion animals, the government has decided to work on a positive list of wild species that can be kept as pets. This has not been developed yet, and the process is that as soon as the law is approved by the Parliament, hopefully by the end of this year, then a technical committee will work to develop this positive list of wild species, which apparently is going to be very short. And from then on, the only wild non-domestic species that will be allowed as pets in Spain will be those included in the positive list. Now, the law has caused a significant debate in society. The hunting lobby is opposed to it. The most conservative or extreme right party, which purports itself as being a defender of traditions, including hunting, is also opposing the law. And on a very different note, some people are concerned that the significant legal protection that is granted to feral cats in this law will have negative side effects as it comes to biodiversity conservation in some areas of Spain, particularly on islands, as it is known that feral cats can be a very significant threat to some endemic species, mainly on islands. Nevertheless, if nothing unexpected happens, the law will be approved, and then we'll have this new scenario as it comes to pet ownership in Spain. Now, the second aspect I would like to touch upon is this change in the veterinary curriculum in Spain. Now, again, to give you a little bit of background, all vet schools in Spain teach animal welfare to some extent, but there is a great variety in terms of extent and depth of the animal welfare training. And one of the difficulties is that the curriculum of veterinary schools is very, very cramped with different topics and subjects. And some people think that including a new subject such as animal welfare is difficult simply because of a lack of time. Now, to solve this, the academic authorities in Spain have decided to expand the the veterinary curriculum from 5 years to 6 years. And this additional year of training of the new vets in Spain will be used, among other things, to provide further training in animal welfare. Animal welfare is not the only thing that will be included in this additional year. Things such as communication skills or antimicrobial resistance issues will be also included, but animal welfare is clearly one of the main reasons for change. So in theory, I think this is a very positive move. If properly implemented, that will mean that in the near future, our veterinarians in Spain will have a much better training in animal welfare sciences. And my last point is this public debate on farming. Over a few months before summer, we had a very active debate on social media and in society in general as it comes to the benefits and disadvantages of large intensive farms. As you know, in many countries, including Spain, the number of farms has decreased, but the average size of farms has increased. And now we are moving very rapidly towards a very intensive industrial farming system with very large farms. And there has been a political debate on whether this is a good move. And in this debate, animal welfare has been a key element. Is not only animal welfare. I think that many of the stakeholders have mixed up animal welfare, food safety, rural development, and environmental issues. But the interesting point is that, as far as I recall, this is the first time when a topic which is partly related to farm animal welfare gets the priority attention in the news in Spain for several months in a row, which is always good, despite the fact that sometimes it became a political issue and that detracted from the quality of the debate. But nevertheless, the debate, I think, was a positive move. And that's everything from me. Thank you very much again for the invite.
Thank you very much, Xavi. That was really interesting. Interesting to hear about this dog test for dog owners. Maybe we can touch on that in the discussion session. Okay, so we'll move on to our next talk, and we're coming to Scotland, where I currently am, and we have Pete Goddard. So Pete is an honorary fellow of the James Hutton Institute in the UK. He is a veterinary surgeon with a particular interest in animal welfare, focusing especially on investigating behavioural and physiological correlates of welfare in ruminants under extensive systems of management. Welcome, Pete, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ellie. thank you also for the invitation to speak today. It's great to be with you here. Okay, so here we go. A quick personal perspective from Scottish and a UK perspective. I'm a member of the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission and the Wild Animal Welfare Committee. That's going to shape my views today, but what I'm going to say is really my own take on some of these things. But by way of background, the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission was established in 2020. It's an independent body to provide advice to the Scottish government on animal welfare, including specifically how the welfare needs of sentient animals are being met by devolved policy. Its role also is to suggest possible legislative and non-legislative routes to ensure the further protection of sentient animals. And for example, over the past 12 months, we've reviewed in depth the activity of the Scottish Government as it affects the welfare of sentient animals. And things coming up in the future will be a report on acoustic deterrent devices used in aquaculture. We're going to be reporting on the use of electronic collars in dogs, and we're also going to report on the welfare of beavers in Scotland. Now, the Wild Animal Welfare Committee was set up in 2014, and that's an independent body too, to provide an evidence base for evaluating, monitoring, assessing and improving decisions affecting the welfare of free-living wild animals in the UK. And we created WARC against the backgrounds of the Farm Animal Welfare Committee, which had farm animals as its focus. And we realized that there was a gap in actually providing the same level of information about wild animals. And that's what we're attempting to do. So what I'm going to cover today are three topics. Three seems to be the magic number for everyone today. So that's sentience. I'm going to talk particularly about the welfare of wild animals. And think a little bit about animal welfare at a time of climate, economic and biodiversity crisis. So first of all, let's think about sentience, and other people have mentioned this already today, but the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission defines animal sentience as the ability to have physical and emotional experiences, both positive and negative, which matter to the animal. And I think the SORC definition of animal sentience was one of the first to explicitly recognize that many sentient animals can experience a range of both positive and negative emotions. But then that requires something of us, and that means we have an ethical duty to minimize unnecessary suffering in animals which are sentient. And sentience relates to a number of features, or partly to some of these. So we need to have sufficient evidence of analogous behaviors of animals, including qualitative behavioral analysis. We need to have evidence of analogous functional anatomy, and we have to have knowledge of the phylogenetic proximity of the animal in question to other animals which we consider sentient, and balance the weight of evidence for these. Now, many people believe the threshold of for sentience has been passed for certainly all vertebrates, but there's more debate about cephalopods and decapod crustaceans at the moment. So to further sort of flesh out these ideas, SORC undertook a case study for one group, the cephalopods, to demonstrate the application of scientific evidence to the assumptions of sentience. And certainly cephalopods and decapods crustaceans, in our view, should be regarded as sentient animals for the purposes of UK animal welfare law. And in fact, in April this year, the UK government passed the Animal Sentience Act relating to this very topic, and to make provision for an animal sentience committee, which is going to function to in relation to our government policy, to scrutinise policy and to scrutinise the government's decision-making process. But it's not there to make decisions for ministers. We're eagerly waiting at the moment the appointment of the chair and the members of the Animal Sentience Committee. That's going to be the next milestone, I think. Right, I wanted to focus particularly on the welfare of wild animals. And here are some of the topics I want to cover briefly. Certainly the main ethical influence of wildlife animal welfare thinking are important, because wildlife welfare is not specifically covered in the various UK Animal Welfare Acts, and certainly free-living wildlife have limited legal protection. But ethical principles for the need to cover the welfare of wild animals come from things like the 7 principles for ethical wildlife control, informed by the 5 domains approach that's been developed over many years by Dave Mellor and colleagues in New Zealand. And also reflecting on the Sharp and Saunders model for ranking animal welfare challenges. So basic animal welfare of wild animals is informed by ethical principles. The use of language is very important. There's been much debate about the negative descriptive terms such as pest or vermin, which presupposes a negative balance in any debate about wild animals. So certainly from the Wild Animal Welfare Committee's point of view, we're advocating against the use of such terms. And Anne has already mentioned the word pest in relation to cats earlier. And Kim also mentioned importantly how the use of language affects how animals are treated. We obviously think the welfare aspects of wildlife management should be evidence-based. The programme of government for Scotland advocated placing welfare at the heart of wildlife management in Scotland. And we're very keen about that. And it certainly emphasises the importance of wildlife welfare at the highest level. And we're working hard to support this through the provision of relevant advice. In Scotland, a groundbreaking Concordat relating to wildlife management has agreed between a range of organisations across Scotland. This aims to have a shared approach where decisions affecting wildlife management include animal welfare. That's an important aspect for us to be highlighted within the Concordat. Now, we've already heard about some wildlife and human conflicts this morning, and it's important to have an ethical framework for managing these. And here we're very much advocating the 7 principles for ethical wildlife control, which many of you will be familiar with, that was developed by Sarah Dubois and colleagues and is becoming widely adopted. And we're pleased to see that this has been debated recently in the Scottish Parliament. Now, I can't go into this obviously in detail at this point, but it does represent a stepwise, engaged process, beginning by examining human practices and using evidence, defining objectives, but always putting animal welfare at the heart of this. But it then leads to the question about who is responsible for demonstrating animal welfare has been central to decision making. And I think in many areas, this is a very important point and one that's not very clearly articulated at the moment. So just to give you a flavour of some of the things that the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission has done in relation to wildlife. Well, we've had input related into the Scottish Government's plan to modernise deer management. We've developed a strong evidence-based position on rodent glue traps. And it's interesting to note that in England, for England and Wales, legislation has recently passed outlawing the use of traps apart from by professionals under licence. Currently, the licence conditions are being developed. We hope in Scotland they'll go for a complete ban. But we also want to emphasise the welfare impacts of changes in legislation, such as the hunting with dogs bill. And we've got quite a lot of ongoing work, looking at the welfare implications of beaver management. I mentioned this earlier, thinking about the conflict between salmon farming and seal predation and cetacean protection. The continuing use of snares in lethal wildlife management is a very significant topic at the moment. And I've mentioned the hunting with dogs bill that's going through Scottish Parliament at the moment. Now, perhaps this has already been mentioned by a few people this morning. Let's think about welfare at a time of climate, economy, and biodiversity crisis. There are lots of pressures on at the moment. Much has been achieved, particularly in farm animal welfare over recent years. But I think we should have a cautionary note at this time when there are lots of pressures on resources in society. And I think probably we need a global perspective to address these issues. And perhaps whilst we've recently relied a lot on consumer purchasing preference, at times of crisis, we may perhaps need to look at more government effort to drive through high animal welfare standards. And Judy touched on this in her talk a bit earlier. We want to continue to focus the debate on wildlife welfare as being important to the individual animal, but we need to think about how best to protect the welfare of wild animals in the environment when we don't have much existing regulation. And we need to further the debate about wildlife welfare and conservation. And I say that specifically. It's not wildlife welfare or conservation, it's wildlife welfare and conservation. So just to end, I would say, as we've heard already a little bit about One Health, the One Health paradigm joins up human, animal and ecosystem health. And a subset of this, of course, is One Welfare. And that's the link between animal welfare, human welfare and environmentally friendly animal keeping systems. So this implies particularly the focus on farm animals. And I would just leave you with the thought that perhaps One Welfare should be extended to include wild species too. So that's a very, very quick romp through some of the issues that are coming up at the moment. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to the debate in a minute.
Thank you very much, Pete. That was great. As I said, any questions, pop them in the chat and we'll come to them after the next talk. So moving on, we're now going from Scotland over to Brazil with Murilo Constantino. As director of FAI in Brazil, Murilo works alongside universities, research centres, private companies and individuals towards a better farming environment. In 2008, he joined FAI, implementing its singular view of how to tackle the challenges of food production on Brazilian conditions for beef cattle, broilers, laying hens, and tilapia. So thank you very much, Murilo, and welcome, and over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank you all for the invitation, especially the organizers. It's a pleasure to be here. So ideally today, I'm going to touch a little bit about my understanding about welfare in Brazil with some facts and some background. So we can discuss, of course, my entire background is on farm animal welfare, but I'll be giving some short information about companion animals as well as a cultural perception of the country and some movements that we have over here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about animal welfare laws and government initiatives in the country, animal welfare research groups, which I think is an important part of the animal welfare movement here in Brazil, animal advocacy movement in Brazil, corporations, and with some opinions and conclusions on the experiences I have on working with animal welfare in here for over 20 years. Brazilian perceptions towards farm animal welfare, especially farm animal welfare, is growing. But as in many other countries, although the majority of the population understands that animals are sentient and they should be treated well, there is still a detachment of the actual knowledge between how farm animals or our food is produced and how farm animals are treated, and the actual what's actually happening on the ground. And of course, this becomes the discussions becomes bigger when we have news and extreme things happening in the country. As an example, the picture you are seeing over there is a situation we had in the country last year, where a buffalo farm was the farmer was arrested because mistreatment of animals. So over 1,000 animals have been left on starvation and on drought because of, according to the farmer, because of lack of financial resources. But in the end, it was realized that he was trying to use the farm for other purposes rather than buffalo production, and just left animals to starve. The farm was arrested in December last year, but now he is off again. But this caused a great national commotion on how and put a spotlight on animal welfare. This is just an example that the animal welfare movement has been steady in the country, but the public perceptions goes up and down according to the most extreme facts that reach the most the news or the most common citizens that are not on the day-to-day of farming. If we translate this to companion animals, we have a different perspective of the society. Many of the politicians we have now, especially on the municipality level, are using animal welfare or companion animal welfare most specifically as a platform for getting animal welfare acts on the municipality level. Just came to my attention, the city where I live in Brazil last week has approved a law for emergency care on the municipality level for companion animals and street dogs and cats to be mandatory. So there is a discrepancy even, and of course, as you might wonder, this caused serious discussions between the funds going to these sort of projects, which are important, but at the same time, we still have very big problems on poverty and people healthcare not to take care very awfully. So there's always discussions around that. In terms of animal welfare laws and governmental initiatives, there's very old laws regarding animal protection and cruelty, which are existent in Brazil, and those laws has been revised, but the enforcement of the laws are not oftenly or doesn't happen very oftenly, I would say. So most of the laws are used as the background, but most of the initiatives are driven by the market. So most of the activities regarding farm animal welfare are mostly driven by private companies or institutions or NGOs putting pressure on large corporations to drive this. And so although the law is there, and there are initiatives in the government like the CBPA, which is a working group inside the Ministry of Agriculture to take care of animal welfare initiatives and try to develop guidelines and actions and other activities to address animal welfare. So the Commission, the law is not in line with the OIE standards, for example, or is below the standards of other countries like the countries in the European Union. So it's still allowed here most controversial factor farming practice, such as soil stalls, farming crates, and battery cages. So they are all permitted by law, but companies feel the pressure from external associations or civil society, or even by economical market pressures to change like that, like banning of feral crates by some of the largest protein animal companies in the country, or the shift from battery cage to cage-free systems that is happening right now. Most of the animal advocacy movements are present in the country, and they are very, very active. They work from lobbying together with the government to also putting conversations with private companies and trying to secure commitments towards animal welfare. Being the most recent campaigns that I can refer to is cage-free egg production, gestational crates for pigs. Human slaughter has been in line for a long time. World Animal Protections has done a very good work in the country to cause a serious shift in the way the animals are slaughtered in here. So even though the law is not very prominent, the guidelines and the reference that towards animal welfare on the production systems are present in most of the certified and the most technical slaughterhouse, although we still have differences from municipal level and state level slaughterhouse that has less of a pressure to improve their production system. And the early discussions are now with the better broiler production commitments in Europe are reaching out here. It's still early discussions, but awareness has been created around the ways broilers are being produced in Brazil. If we talk about corporations, the corporations, both local and also global corporations, are on the spot when we talk about NGO campaigning and also on the public domain. So global food brands extend their commitments not only to imported animal-based products from Brazil, but also to the national market, meaning that they try to maintain the same levels of commitments regarding farrowing rates or cage-free eggs, and which drives not only the export market, which is very, very important, but also the internal market to be aligned to those commitments. And the campaign is a very big part of that. And the technical advice for them is becoming greater in order to match the requirements, the standards, and of course the practice that are happening in the country. For me, one of the leaders or the most prominent actors on the animal welfare in the group in Brazil is the animal welfare research groups. There are 55 recognized animal welfare research groups in Brazil. They all have global level researchers like Professor Mateus, Professor Carla Molento, Professor Hotzel. They are all working very hard, and the interesting is that they work not only on the academic level, but they also work together with the government and together with private corporations in order to bring animal welfare to life. So it stops being just academic, but also implementing animal welfare practice on the farm level, transport level, slaughter level, and all other important matters regarding animal welfare. So and resulting in particular consultancy groups and individuals. So I am one of those that went off from the ethical group working with Professor Mateus, and now I have most of my work is with private companies on animal welfare, best practice, and implementations of standards all over the country and also the world. And I have still the pleasure to work with many of the research working groups in the country. Fish welfare is becoming on the spotlight over here as well, and that's one of the reasons is FAI working with LABEA and YORA on defining a practical fish welfare assessment protocol for tilapia, also for shrimp and carp. This has already been implemented in the country, and not surprisingly, it's being well accepted by farmers and companies because they see animal welfare as a way to support and improving aquaculture productions, because our approach is through the environment, through feed, nutrition, genetics, and behavior. So incorporating animal welfare as a central point to support farmers to improve their productivity, to improve their economics, and also to improve the environment, but also keeping the ethical aspect of it in the middle to prevent those productions that are still in development to go further as the most intensive agricultural productions like salmon or broiler. So is using the experience of terrestrial animals to bring to aquaculture is being quite positive. Just to conclude, opinion and conclusions, I really believe that by being the major animal protein producer, Brazil needs to be aligned to global consumer perceptions around animal welfare. And this is very, very important, not for the development of us as a society, but also for economical purpose, so we can keep competitive in the market. Brazilian research is being able not only to review and adapt concepts from other countries like UK, but also to generate original work that can be applied by Brazil and Brazil-like environmental communities like South America or even Asia. The direction of farm animal welfare discussions needs to go further into all the environmental challenges we face. So animal welfare is going beyond just the 5 freedoms or a life worth living, is going through deforestation aspects, regenerative agriculture, all this linked together, carbon footprint. So animal welfare needs to be entangled with those discussions to prevent that one carbon footprint discussions go over animal welfare. So this needs to be in the middle as a central point. There is a recognition in many companies that animal welfare is good for business. And there is a very strong recognition, especially on beef farmers, that animal welfare is good for the farming environment. So best handling practices is becoming more and more common and is becoming a standard rather than the old ways of handling animals at the farm level. So the most important part now on some aspects is the need of knowledge and resources to adopt and to improve. So it's not that the farmers are bad people. They just sometimes doesn't have the knowledge or the resources to go to the next mile or to improve their productions. That's a general overview of what I need to say. Thank you all very much for your time, and I'll be happy to participate in the discussions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. A really nice overview of everything that's going on in Brazil. Okay, so we now have about 15 minutes for some questions. Now, there have been a few questions you can put in the chat. If anyone's got any more, then please add them in as we go along. So one of the first ones we got was for Xavier, if you're still there. Libby had a question about whether the positive list will be just mammals or will be other species as well.
Yeah, thank you. No, as far as I know, the positive list will include all different kinds of animals, not just mammals, birds, and probably reptiles, amphibians, fishes, and maybe invertebrates as well.
Great, thank you. And another question, it's kind of similar to one that I had actually, from Claire, who would like to ask a little bit more about the new test for dog owners in Spain. So what has evolved and how will it be administered, so online or in person?
Yeah, we don't know yet whether the course that owners will have to take before the test will be delivered online or in person. That is something to be discussed. But what we do know is that the course will cover the basic needs of dogs in terms of vaccination, deworming, behavioral needs, enrichment, and so on. How this will be delivered in practice is something that will be developed later on. But the idea is to tell potential owners that having a dog entitles an investment in terms of time, commitment, and resources, and hopefully make the owners which are not ready to provide that change their mind.
Great, thank you. I've also actually got a question about the development of the animal welfare curriculum for vet school university. Do you have any more sort of information about how it will be developed?
Yeah, the idea is that we have now 5 years, it will become 6. And the idea is that this extra time will be used to cover animal welfare, antimicrobial resistance, communication skills, and so on. As for animal welfare, the idea is that we will provide a more extensive training in the basic principles of animal welfare during the first year. And then we'll have specific modules of animal welfare related to farm animals for each of the main farm species, companion animals and wild animals, and the human care in the second last and last years of the curriculum. So it will be like 2 sections, a general one at the very beginning of the training and a more specific one at the end of the training.
Great, thanks. Also a follow-up question from Claire suggesting that should all animal owners, keepers be required to pass a similar test, irrespective of the species concerned? What do you think about that?
No, that's a very good question. Interestingly enough, and I don't know why that is the case, the law is very specific and only dog owners will be required to pass the test.
Okay, great, thank you. We've got some more questions and some good ones from Carol. What I might do is I might keep them to the end so we have all our speakers in for the panel discussion for the sort of more general questions. if anyone got anything else, please pop them into the chat. We've got some comments about Andrew Gardner agreeing about language and the subject status of all animals is interesting, pest, vermin, etc. Also pronouns. I think also another point from Libby looking at references to harvesting farm fish or a crop of lambs. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back to the final session of this webinar. We were supposed to have a presentation by Julio Ramirez from Colombia, but he doesn't appear to be on this call. So if you are here, Julio, please get in touch. But Andrew has very kindly moved his talk forward. So we'll carry on with Andrew Rowan's talk. So Andrew Rowan is from the USA and has more than 40 years experience in wild animal welfare science and animal environmental advocacy. He has served on many government and corporate consultative committees, on numerous boards of national and international NGOs, and most recently served as the CEO of Humane Society International. Dr. Rowan was a professor at Tufts Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine. He is currently President and Chief Programme Officer of Wellbeing International. Welcome, Andrew, and thank you very much. Over to you.
I'm going to talk about a few introductory comments, and I'm going to talk more about the growth of the movement in the United States and some of the current characteristics of animal protection in the United States, rather than specific projects. But I'll talk about some of the current issues at the end here. So there's surprisingly little attention being paid to animal protection economics and growth, which I think is unfortunate, because the animal movement globally has changed dramatically in the last 20 to 30 years. And globally, funding by international animal protection groups has grown from around 140 million in 2000 to over 400 million today. That's a very substantial growth, and I think reflects the interest in animal welfare and animal protection globally, not just in the developed world, in Europe and in North America, but in other parts of the world as well. China, for example, has seen a huge growth in animal protection in the last 20 years. And we can see that from Brazil, there's a growing animal protection movement, South America, growing animal protection movement in general, and Asia, of course, huge growth. And Europe, I haven't really been tracking the economics in Europe, but you can see increased growth there with outfits like Dogs Trust going from £10 million a year in income to £100 million a year in the past 30 or so years. So, I mean, a huge change in just the resources available to animal protection in the US, but elsewhere as well. So this is a reflection of animal protection growth in the US, showing the number of local and specialty groups, the national groups, and then the dark blue line is the animal protection income per capita. And it's about $10 per capita. It's about for 1,000 people, that's 10,000. So it's running now at about $10 to $12 per capita. And you can see that back in the early 1900s, we're looking at sort of $1 per capita. So there's a huge growth, not just in the number of organizations, but also in the income coming into those organizations. And this is an example taken from IRS, the Internal Revenue Service tax data, looking at the number of organizations, NGOs in animal protection that were founded and the years they were founded, and then the growth. And this was in 2006. There were just under 6,000 animal protection NGOs. They're now over 24,000. So most of those are small, of course, but nonetheless, there's been this huge growth in animal protection. And if you look at the differences in terms of per capita income for animal protection in different states, you can see that the actual numbers vary considerably from $2.33 in Utah to over $13 in Massachusetts and Colorado. And I project that if we could get those income numbers up to the sort of the high levels of the states, Colorado and Massachusetts, we would be raising somewhere between $6 to $7 billion a year for animal protection in the United States. So this is the total income in 2009, 2010. And what you see there are the non-profits, the local organizations, the larger local organizations, the national organizations, and then animal control operations. These are the municipal entities that run shelters in each municipality, and that's not accounted for in terms of the IRS. They don't report their data to the Internal Revenue Service, but you can get the data from municipal budgets, and it's approximately $1 billion a year being spent on animal control. Seems to be stuck. Okay, there we go. So there are about 40 to 60 national organizations, and this is a very, it's based upon my particular determination of what is national versus what is local. And the big ones, of course, the Humane Society of the United States, the American SPCA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, Best Friends, Farm Sanctuary, and the rest of the organizations are mostly local. There are approximately 4,000 brick and mortar shelters that take animals in their local municipalities, and there are thousands more animal rescue groups that are now currently are picking up animals, keeping them in homes, and then getting them adopted or relinquished into shelters. And there are currently about 24,000 animal protection organizations, but the vast majority are tiny. That is, they have budgets of under $100,000 a year, which may not seem like tiny for some people, but it is in the United States. But only around 400 to 500 have budgets of more than $1 million a year. So the legislation issues, this is in the United States, as in Canada and in Australia and some other countries where you have sort of federal versus local or state level legislation. The federal laws in the United States are permitted on 3 grounds: national security, public health, and basically leveling the playing field for interstate commerce. So those are the 3 reasons for having a federal law. And as a result, you don't have any federal laws on companion animals, because those are not seen to be either national security issues, public health issues, or reflect interstate commerce, although there are a few that are involved in interstate commerce. The federal humane slaughter and lab animal legislation were based on protecting interstate commerce. Wild animal protection at the federal level, there is some, such as the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, but mostly wild animals are under state control. And then cruelty and companion animal legislation there is some state legislation, but it's mainly a local or municipal approach. There's a patchwork of legislation, and most legislation is pursued at a state level, such as establishing felony animal cruelty penalties. So in the United States, there's been a huge upsurge in animal protection in the 1960s and 70s. This is during the animal rights stage of animal protection. And most of the early 60s, 70s, 80s activity focused on research and on companion animal issues. There was some wildlife, such as the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, but most of the energy was going into animal research campaigning and companion animals. Farm animal advocacy begins to emerge in the 1990s, and in the last 20 years, the dog and cat overpopulation issue in the United States has been mostly resolved. And in fact, we're now looking at a shortage of dogs for pets. And there's a big focus on puppy mills, as they're called in the United States, or puppy farms in Europe, and animal cruelty issues. Tremendous growth in farm animal campaigning, and then also a tremendous growth in the political influence that the animal protection movement now has. If you look at what's been happening to dogs and cats, companion animals in the United States, from 1970 to the present, the green line shows the number of dogs and cats that were euthanized in shelters in millions. I mean, it was and that's on the right-hand scale, so it's gone from about 13 million euthanized in shelters down to less than 300,000. And the pet population is in the left-hand scale, and it shows gone from 60 million, this is dogs and cats, to around about 140 million today. So big change in this issue of dog and cat overpopulation, unwanted animals. If you look at farm animal advocacy, this graph starts in 2011, in July 2011, ends in January 2013, showing the change in corporate activity on farm animal protection and basically sort of promoting humane, like cage-free eggs or the gestation crate-free pork, that sort of thing. And a big campaign to get the corporations to pay attention, and they have in spades. If you look at animal cruelty legislation, this chart shows the states of America with felony dogfighting laws, the dogs, felony cockfighting laws for the hens, and felony cruelty laws for the cats. And that's in 1985. In 2013, 28 years later, nearly every state has now a felony animal cruelty provision, and most have banned dogfighting and cockfighting. There's still a few holdouts, but every state now has a felony animal cruelty law. And actually, I think every state now has a felony dogfighting and cockfighting law. The current issues, farm animals has grown dramatically as an issue. You can see that again by tracking the income going into farm animal specialty groups, grown dramatically in this century. Lab animals, it's not as big a focus as it used to be. In the 60s and 70s, it was a major focus. But recently, the US, one of the few countries that allowed research on chimpanzee, on grade 8s, invasive research on grade 8s, has stopped that. And there are now a number of interesting issues, replacing lab animal testing. US is now leading the campaign. It's no longer the EU in the lead, as it has been for many years. The US is now a leader in replacing animal testing in safety situations. Companion animals, as I said, the overpopulation issue has largely been resolved. Now there's a major issue on puppy mills farms and the humane production of puppies, but there are now even supply concerns for dogs and cats. Wild animals, very broad range of topics. You've got an extensive whaling campaign been going on for years. The wolf issue has heated up dramatically in the last few years. Wolves were protected under the Endangered Species Act. That protection has recently been lifted, and so now people are going out and shooting wolves in large numbers. Places like Wyoming or Idaho, Montana have been allowing people to go out and shoot the wolves, even though you've got relatively few wolves in the state. But the wolf is a very hot issue, as we've seen in Europe, in Norway particularly. It's not really clear why we have such hatred for wolves, but we do. There are also these wildlife killing contests where people go out and kill as many of a particular species of wildlife, and the one who kills the most is the winner. These are being progressively banned now in their states, but it's still going on fairly regularly in the United States. So in conclusion, the US and the global animal protection movement has grown substantially in the last 50 years. There are a number of indications that animal protection is getting increasing political support, and we heard a bit on that in some of the previous speakers. I sort of am wondering what the potential growth here is. Currently raising and spending about $5 billion a year on animal protection issues. Could it be 10 billion? Could we go up to 15 billion? It's not really clear what the ceiling there is. But we do need to do better at maximizing revenues from multiple income sources and tracking community and state measures to evaluate progress. I've always felt that we should have a relatively simple set of measures to track progress, such as income into the animal protection movement per capita. I showed you the state numbers, how they vary from one state to another. and animal metrics. So you can look at shelter intakes and euthanasia rates per 1,000 people for specific communities and states. On a national average, you're seeing about 1 dog euthanized per 1,000 people. In UK, it's less than 0.1 dog per 1,000 people. So there's still a lot of room for improvement that we can have in North America. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. That was fascinating. Thanks. Okay, so we're now going to move on to a 20-minute panel discussion and audience Q&A. We do still have some questions in the chat from earlier, which I'm going to address first. If we could have all the speakers who are still in the chat to turn on their camera and their microphone, that'd be great. So I'll start with a question that we got from Carol slightly earlier, which was, she says, a slightly controversial question. What do the presenters think about the One Health and One Welfare movements, specifically the tendency to prioritise human health and welfare in any debates involving these terms? Are they genuinely useful, the advancement of animal welfare, or only useful for research funding applications? So does anyone of the speakers want to kick us off on what they think?
Well, I'll certainly take the One Health, One Welfare question. It's something that's been intriguing me for some time. When I was at Tufts Veterinary School, there was a big push on One Health. And at the time, what One Health appeared to be was an attempt to gain more traction for veterinary input in terms of international health issues. It's still, One Health is still being driven mostly by the veterinarians rather than by the medical profession. But I think the COVID pandemic has really made a big dent in that particular situation. And so I think One Health is going to become much more relevant and much more widespread in the coming decade. One Welfare is being tacked on to One Health, and it's something that I've always wondered about, but I'm seeing increasing attention being paid to this at the amongst the international level. We had the discussion about the Welfare Nexus resolution at UNEA, the United Nations Environment Assembly, that passed earlier this year. The Secretary General of the UN issued a report last year that was remarkable. I mean, read as though it was written by an animal rights activist. He talked about respecting animals, that all animals are sentient, and that these issues need to be taken into consideration when dealing more broadly with not just animal welfare, but also with human health and sustainability. So I think we're going to see One Welfare coming more and more to the fore in the coming decade, as these issues are sort of brought up in international arenas.
Thank you. It's really interesting. Any other speakers got any other comments they want to add regarding the One Welfare concept? Yes, Pete? Oh, I think you're still muted.
Sorry, sorry, thanks. Yes, no, I think Andrew's put that very well, but I think it also, I think we need a better articulation of the welfare element for animals within the One Welfare paradigm. I think it's a balance between the three elements, but I think the welfare part hasn't been very or adequately described. But I think bringing these things together reflects back on what Mark was saying right at the start in terms of the connectedness of humans, the environment, and the animals within it. So I think it's a good idea, but I think it needs quite a lot more work yet. So you're muted now, Ellie.
Oh, sorry.
That's one all.
I was like, yeah, definitely. Thank you very much. Anyone else want to add anything on the One Welfare topic? Oh, we'll go for Marilla first and then Anne.
No, just to make a point regarding when the discussions around, especially farm animal welfare, we've been in the group of researchers in Brazil and also some working groups here is being very effective, being able to include animal welfare as a central point for all the discussions, which involves better quality of life for animals and people and the benefits it gives to the environment as well. So I believe that the one welfare aspect of it can be centrally not focusing only on the health of animals, which cause lots of discussions, but we've been implementing situations where looking to animals as individuals and looking to animals as a particular, giving you the answers about how good the environment and the animals and the people around it are good, you can broaden this discussion. So just that I think I agree with Pete where welfare should be more on the core of the conversation, not an added-on situation on those discussions.
Great, thank you. Anne?
I can understand the questioner's concern about one welfare and one health, that they are in a way easy to talk about at the level of policy, but difficult to implement at the level of practice. One person I found very helpful on this front is David Fraser, who developed his practical ethic for animals based on 4 principles, and hopefully I can remember them. The first is to provide good lives for the animals in our care. The second is to treat suffering with compassion. The third is to be mindful of unseen or unintended harms. And the fourth is to protect the life-sustaining ecosystems and balances of nature. And those principles, I think, are really critical, and they need to be, I think they're very consistent with the One Welfare framework, and they can be implemented at the level of policy. But when you're doing things, I mean, as when I'm at work as a veterinary practitioner, I can provide good lives for animals and I can treat suffering with compassion, but then it's harder to be mindful of unseen harm and harder still to protect the life-sustaining balances of nature. And so I think it is difficult for people at the coalface sometimes to implement those. And I think it's very important that we aspire to it. But I can understand why some people might think, oh, gee, are these concepts really any good or not? Are they really helping us? I think that they need to be developed further, and we need some more practical steps to implement them.
I think exactly, yeah. Practical implementation is definitely key. Okay, great. Thank you very much. And Carol, hope that answers your question. So we got another question from Manuel, which states, in 2016, a law came into force in Portugal preventing euthanasia of stray animals in shelters, except for in cases of incurable disease and when it proves to be the only and indispensable way to eliminate the animal's irrecoverable pain and suffering. Are there similar laws in other countries, and what is the opinion of the speakers on these kinds of measures? So does anyone want to tackle this question first?
So, well, I can't really answer your question, but I can say that in the just as a bit of background, in the UK, at the start of the COVID crisis, there was a desperate rush to get particularly dogs as pets, and there was a huge boom of dog breeding, sometimes by unscrupulous breeders. The prices of dogs shot up. So I'm interested to hear some of the comments from other speakers about sort of regulations of dog breeding. But now the situation has sort of, the market's been saturated by the number of dogs. People are now struggling with the cost of living crisis, and now though many of those dogs are particularly dogs, but also cats, are ending up in shelters. And now the shelters are really becoming overwhelmed, to the extent that some shelters are now paying private people to actually foster the dogs from the shelters because they've got insufficient capacity. Whether it's going to lead to an increase in euthanasia, I'm not sure. That would obviously be the last resort for the shelter, but you can see that this is a sort of time bomb waiting to happen.
Yeah. Anne, please come in.
Yeah, as I was reading the wording that Manuel had provided, and I think that provides a very high threshold for euthanasia, and I'm not sure as a clinical practitioner that I could establish that in most of the cases where I feel euthanasia is in the interest of animals in the first place. Remembering that to establish that an animal cannot be treated, that it's got a terrible prognosis, that it is experiencing suffering that cannot be alleviated, sometimes that can be very difficult. And I guess the thing that I worry about with that legislation is that it also doesn't seem to take into account psychologically unhealthy animals or euthanasia that might be ethically justifiable, but it might not amount to euthanasia. It might be more like humane killing. So I guess I'm thinking about an example where we've got an extremely dangerous dog that has a history of severely injuring people, maybe has killed a child. I personally feel like there's got to be scope for ethically justifiable humane killing, even if it doesn't meet that criteria for euthanasia. And the other thing I would say is that I think if we're thinking about a one welfare lens, what about the burden of care for some owners? I've seen, I guess, some situations where there's advanced veterinary care offered, or quite heroic or invasive procedures or novel procedures even on animals that are then kind of made to suffer to extend their life because there's a human that's very attached to them. And there is technically treatment that's available, but is it in the interests of the animal? Is it really addressing suffering? So yeah, I just wonder how that legislation is applied with some consideration of the human-animal bond as well. I don't know. So I'm sending a question back to Manuel, I guess. Sorry.
Any of the other speakers got input from shelter animals where they're based? No. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if this is a question or a more of a comment. Just find it. So we had something come in from Leopoldo, who was suggesting, and wouldn't it be more appropriate in terms of physiology and semantics to eliminate the word unnecessary when it comes to legislation on animal suffering? Is there a necessary suffering? And worst of all, at the practical level of penalising apparent and habitual behaviours, what tool is used to discriminate between necessary and unnecessary suffering? Anyone have any input they want to add on unnecessary suffering? I guess it's quite a legal term, isn't it, when especially when it comes in with the UK legislation.
Yeah, I guess sorry, Mark.
Mark, do you want to come in? Oh, I think you're still muted as well.
Yeah.
There we go.
I think it's just a synonym for suffering that's justified. And we do an awful lot to animals. We have an impact on them, as I said earlier, and that affects their lives. Animal welfare can be changed in minor ways. For instance, if you build a fence up a hill which keeps animals down the bottom sometimes and they want to go up the top, that's a change in their welfare, admittedly a very minor one. But the other end of the scale, you can tail dock sheep, for instance, which is quite painful, but we justify that in terms of making it easier to share and clean them up and perhaps prevent fly strike in that as well. And we term that as justified, and that's necessary suffering. And I think that's just where that term's come from.
Thanks. Pete, have you got anything else to add?
Other than just to say, as sort of Mark implies, it's often down to the courts to decide rather than animal welfare scientists. Now, perhaps we could be more helpful, but it's often taken out of our hands in terms of when a decision like that's made.
Yeah, definitely. Any other input from the speakers? If not, I can move on to the next question. Okay. I think we had a question for Andrew, who says, well, also mentions well done for overcoming the tech issues. Can you expand a little on the justification for lifting the wolf protections? Is human-wildlife conflict a major factor?
Well, I mean, the wolf is a very special issue, and it goes back basically to the Munchausen tales and those sorts of issues. You know, I mean, it's part of our sort of race memory, shall we say, that wolves are creatures to be feared and hated. And there was this remarkable situation in Norway back in the early 80s when a wolf made its way down near Oslo, and there was a huge uproar, and the local hunter said he would save the country from this wolf. Went out and finally shot it. Had the carcass in his living room where he doused it with champagne while in front of the press. Took it to an old age home and doused it in champagne. Took it to the parliament, doused it in champagne again. I mean, it was just remarkable that one wolf could create such an outcry. But wolves are something that really sort of goes deep into human psyche, and it's in the West, the ranch, the only good wolf is a dead wolf, and so bringing the wolves back into Wyoming, into Yellowstone National Park, and into the northwestern states has been fraught with controversy ever since they started coming back, and it's basically an easy coup for a politician to say, well, we'll just kill all the wolves, that gets the farmer vote, the rancher vote, and so it's a strange phenomenon, quite frankly, and it's just I don't think we really sort of come to grips with it in any meaningful way. It's just some people hate wolves, some people love them, and it's a marker of wilderness that there's a wolf out there, and wilderness is something that people either love or fear. And I mean, I think back in the times when the early settlers came to the United States, wilderness was a place to be feared. The cities were a place to be safe. Now in the United States, wilderness is a place to be safe, and the cities are places of danger. So there's been a major change in how we see wilderness, wildlife, and wild animals. And it's not clear that we've yet really come to grips with the strangeness of some of these behaviors. And the Endangered Species Act, it's been just a political football, and the wolf issue has been a political football for the Endangered Species Act for years. And to keep the Endangered Species Act it's under threat, constant threat, may not be re-upped. It has to be renewed every 5 years, and there's a threat that it will not be renewed because of various issues, and the wolf is one of those issues.
Thanks. And there's a comment in the chat from Heather. There's a theory that the long history of humans' fears of wolves, as Andrew says, was back in such a long way, it's grounded in rabies. Great, thank you very much. I've got a question. I wonder if Mark could expand a little bit on the recommendation for the welfare of bees that's been developed in New Zealand.
I thought you'd forgotten that. No, it's just still very early days. They're just assessing whether or not to go with the code of welfare. There's a lot of controversy over it because it obviously doesn't fit into our definition of an animal under the Animal Welfare Act. And there's a bit of suspicion that the minister might be using it as a way to get one over the beekeeping community. I don't know whether that's true or not, but all the same, there are reasons for keeping bees healthy. There are reasons for keeping them happy. So why not?
So do you know anything that's going to be included in the recommendations?
No.
No, it's not that right. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, this is going to be a last call for any questions or comments for our speakers as we come to the end of this morning's session. Just as a couple of comments.
I'd like to make a quick comment on bees, by the way.
Yes,
there's remarkable Lars Chitka in London has been doing some remarkable research indicating that bees have all sorts of remarkable sentience qualities. So just as a throwaway line, my grandfather was an entomologist and showed me the bees and ants that he studied. I'm not sure what he would say about this today, but I mean, it's just remarkable the research that Chitka is doing with bumblebees and other bees.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and Heather's also agreed, saying his book is amazing, well worth a read. So thanks. Perfect. Well, if we've not got any other comments or questions. Oh yeah, sorry, Mark, carry on. Sorry.
Just one I'll add to Andrew's one. I think spiders probably aren't very far behind bees as well. So it just really opens up the field an awful lot.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, great. I want to take this opportunity to thank you all very much for your time this morning. I know some of you are up at crazy times in the morning or in the evening. So thank you very much for attending and telling us about some of the welfare things that are going on wherever you're based. It's been a really great morning, and there's some comments coming in the chat basically reiterating that. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in today. If this session will have been recorded and it will be put up on the AWSELVA YouTube and the AWSELVA website in due course. We'd also love to hear from everyone who was involved today, if there's anything they'd like to share about some of the welfare aspects of wherever they're based, and we might be able to include that in the AWSELVA journal or the AWSELVA newsletter. So please check out our website and contribute, and there's an email address on there which you can send to us there. So thank you very much, and thanks, and hopefully see you all again soon.